It is March 2nd, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I am Wallace Smith, and I'm sitting here with my co-host, Mr. John Robinson. Mr. Robinson, thank you for allowing me in your office once again to record a podcast.
I'm not sure I have any choice, but you're welcome.
I guess I could, I've got a key and everything. I guess I could just get in.
Yeah.
Let's jump right into it, actually. What is our topic today?
Well, we were discussing how we would summarize what our goal here is today, but we wanted to talk about actually the Tomorrow's World magazine, talk a little bit about the articles that are in it, and why they should be of interest to you, to the listener out there, especially the youth. We have no idea how many how many of our younger audience members actually look at the magazine with any regularity, and fair enough. We know who our target audience. No, not our target audience. We have a general sense of who reads it the most with some of our market research, and it is an older group. But I think that hopefully after we're finished here, you'll agree. We have some. When we switched to 10 issues, which allowed us to be a little more, I wouldn't say news oriented, but we could, current events a little bit more. It's more relevant than ever, in my opinion, in some ways, and I think worth your time to review it.
Absolutely, and I think as the executive editor and managing editor of the magazine, we might have an interest. We might know a little bit something about what's in the magazine and why you should read it. So absolutely, let's jump right on it. Welcome again. And before we jump into talking about the magazine, actually, I'd like to ask Mr. Robinson to speak to the fact that, when I first started getting the magazine, back then it was the Plain Truth magazine, I was already 18 and was very interested in the truth. It was brand new to me. Everything was new to me. And so I was kind of gobbling it up back then. At the same time, many of our listeners, teens and young adults, have grown up in the church, and I feel like Mr. Robinson's perspective probably mirrors yours that much more. And Mr. Robinson, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I've heard you say that, when you were growing up, you didn't necessarily read the church's magazine all that often. Is that correct?
Yes, especially when I was a teenager. I did not. Like, I didn't even know that. So here's an example. The church had a very clear distinction between, we had several publications. We had the Plain Truth, which was very much an outward-facing magazine. It was designed for people not in the church to read. But then
the Tomorrow's World.
Like the Tomorrow's World, exactly. Then we had the Good News magazine, which was, you were expected, that readers were understood to have had some more actual understanding of the church's teachings.
Mm-hmm.
But we also had all these youth magazines as well. We would have, Youth 86, Youth 87. I guess they updated it every year for the year. Mm-hmm. And my sister, I think I showed it to you. We had a cover in here of Youth 87, I think, and it had my sister was one of the ones that was.
I remember that. Yeah. You showed me. She's actually on the cover with the kids. Yeah.
So I don't know how much. I just was a teenage boy running around, not even running around. Spent time with my friends in the church, mostly, actually, and played a lot of basketball. And it wasn't a big interest for me. I didn't get really interested until about 22 or 23 when I started paying attention. Then after that, it's funny thinking back on it. I read the magazine religiously every issue for the next 7 or 8 years.
Wow. No pun intended.
No. That's right. Yeah.
So something kind of clicked in you, and then you began to really get serious about it.
And I did find that the articles quite helpful, even though the Tomorrow's World magazine again is mostly written for an audience that's not really the church members. Mm-hmm, but that doesn't mean you can't still get a lot of value out of it.
Oh no, and I think that's and we actually plan on talking about very specific upcoming articles here in a moment, but I think. And Mr. Ames stresses this so successfully and so consistently that, part of it is definitely the content that's in there. And sometimes I will get questions from members, younger or older, and you realize, we actually just talked about that in the magazine, And so I'm not saying I'm holding them to not having read it, but at the same time, it does address things that people in the church as well want to know, even though it's geared towards an outside audience. And yet, at the same time, there is something, as Mr. Ames highlights, to knowing what are we saying to the world,
exactly.
what is Christ's message to the world? What are the things that Christ is leading Mr. Weston and the church to focus on in terms of what's going on in society and principles? And there's something about if we really do care about the work to the world, then we're going to want to be plugged in and to know what is that work? What is it that we're saying?
I when Mr. Strain had some medical issues a few years ago, and so he couldn't perform his responsibilities in the same way until he recovered. But when he did, I was so fascinated by his first sermon back was, "Hey, we should pay attention to what's on the leader of the church's mind.
Yeah.
What is he being inspired to write and talk about?" And he went back through what he'd done over the last year. It was really quite interesting, and I could not agree more with that whole idea. In fact, I added to our notes, Mr. Smith, my personal notes. I thought we might actually mention the personal that Mr. Weston writes that leads off the magazine, because to me it was very much that idea of what's he thinking about, what is he noticing, and then his lead article that we'll get to in a minute, you'll see very clearly what's on his mind, and it's very relevant, relevant.
Absolutely, it's a. Mr. Armstrong used to do that for the Plain Truth magazine, the personal from the editor-in-chief, and we've continued that. And so in fact, you even see those pages before you get to the table of contents. You see, 2 full pages of something on Mr. Weston's mind, a personal from the editor-in-chief, and it is helpful. And I should go ahead and mention, we are going to be talking not about, you think we would talk about this one, but when I had this idea this week, it struck me for some reason, because as we'll talk about it, this one's more in our minds, the one we're going to talk about. It would kind of make sense to talk about the March issue that most of you, if you didn't receive it in your mailbox today, it's coming in the next few days, because we're very on time about our magazines. And I know we got ours because one of my sons mentioned how much he really enjoyed the cover of this one, and kudos to Mr. John Robinson and Mr. Ben Graham for working very hard on dialing in this particular cover of Mr. Ames's article on Jerusalem as the capital of the world. We're not going to talk about the current magazine, though, because frankly, we just finished the next magazine, and the next one, which is the April-May issue, is far more on our minds. But I cannot help myself. I do want to encourage you to read the current magazine. Not only does it have Mr. Ames's article about how Jerusalem will be the capital of the world, it has my own article titled Evolution's Dirty Little Secrets. I really enjoyed the illustrating they did for that. Talks about what's going on in England and how they're having a hard time understanding who they really are as a country and as a people. Anyway, there's several articles worthwhile, including Young People Need to Read This, and this was written by Mr. Brian Fall, privileged to have been his pastor back in Ohio. He has an article about the importance of sleep and why God designed it to do the things that it does. So anyway, I highly encourage you, read the current issue. But Mr. Robinson and I have been slaving away, not by ourselves, but together with our amazing editorial crew, to finish the April-May issue. In fact, even before we jump into that, Mr. Robinson, you were making a point, because here it is. We were wrapping up this magazine, and it's still the end of February, and yet this is the April-May issue, and we've got to send it off to the printer. And you had some observations about that I thought were worthwhile.
Well, I thought it might help our audience understand some of the magazine production cycle, because, and this was exacerbated when we only did 6 issues. So each issue was on the newsstands, as it were, for 2 months. Just you don't have to think very long to realize how difficult. Let's say that a war broke out, or just something in the world happened, and we're like, oh, let's get that in the next magazine. We get the next magazine, then suddenly it ends and nobody's talking about it, but it's on the cover of the magazine for the next 2 months. So a lot of the articles are written, less the main articles, but the other articles are often written almost a month before we start actually the editorial process.
Well, I would actually add the main articles too, because that's part of our challenge in laying it out, is we really keep the main articles in mind, and we have to get feedback concerning covers. So actually the main articles, with maybe the exception of mine, because the editor tends to give me a lot of room in terms of turning my things in late.
He really bends over backwards for you.
It's one of the challenges of being the editor and the author of an article, is I give myself way too much leeway.
Yeah. We go to the editor and I say, hey, Mr. Smith's article's behind, about slightly behind schedule, and the editor always says, Just relax. Give him.
I know him. He's
Don't
such a
rush
nice
him.
guy, you know.
It'll come together.
But yeah, it's a challenge to get those in time, and we have some flexibility, and we've taken advantage of that. But still, you have people that are writing. Not only is it a month ahead, 2 months. It used to be 2 months ahead before publishing, but the article has often been finished even a month before that.
So here's an example. Yesterday, which was March 1st, we received our March magazine.
Mhm.
Mr. Ames would be pleased. It was on the day when we received it.
He loves
Okay.
getting the magazine on the day, the first day of the month.
So that was for the March magazine, but also that day, yesterday, Wednesday, March 1st, we approved the magazine to print with the printer.
That's the next one. That's
for
April,
the next
May.
one, for April,
right.
May. And it takes them about 2 to 3 weeks to print the magazine, and then they handle all the mailing for us. So they take 500,000 magazines. Well, we're just rounding things off for simplicity. And they inkjet everybody's individual address on there. Then they put them in a certain order. They load them in an 18-wheeler. They drive them to one of the regional post office, one of the major ones. It used to be Denver for a while. I'm not sure where they do it now. And then it takes a week in the mail stream. So you could actually see just with that how difficult it is to actually hit the first day of the month.
Yes.
We don't have a lot of control over it, but we got the system in pretty well where it hits most of the time. But here's the point. So it's going to be, we're done. We've written our articles. We've illustrated it, and it's going to be a month before everybody out there sees it, and we have no control over what's going to happen in the world, between now and then. And so we have to be careful about how we write our articles,
Right.
and stay a little bit big picture, which we could talk about that when we get to Mr. Weston's article. I have a comment about
Yes.
the hazards of trying. We can't be newscasters. We can't cover the news in real time.
Especially these days, it used to be news would take a while to disseminate, but now with 24/7 channels all the time, CNN, et cetera, Fox News. And so we really work hard to write them in such a way that we lower the probability they'll become out of date a month from now. So we may not get too specific about some of the things we say because, frankly, things are still developing.
Right.
And really, we want to focus on spiritual and prophetic principles anyway, which really helps. We're not trying to be Newsweek. We're trying to preach the gospel and to help everyone understand that they need to come out of this perverse generation, like the Apostle Peter said. But at the same time, what we're seeing around us is part of what helps to make that point clear. And consonant with your what you just mentioned, Mr. Robinson, it just seems like as time is moving forward, world events are just speeding up.
Yes.
Used to be waiting a month or two. Well, it really wasn't that much of a big deal. And now it's amazing. You can have alliances flip. You can have some major scandal or something happen to taint someone's name that you have an article about them. It's amazing how much can happen now just in the span of that month or month and a half or 2 months after an article's been written.
Well, like when Queen Elizabeth died, I can't remember where we were in the news cycle, but it wasn't the best timing for us.
Yes.
And by the time we could actually address it in the next magazine, even by then we recognized that all the events that surrounded her death and the funeral and all, it was quite dramatic, really pretty interesting. The talk had already cooled off.
Right. And we really had to weigh. It was probably the worst moment it could have been in terms of the printing process. In terms of, I'm not saying, how dare she die at an inconvenient moment. Definitely not saying that, all respect.
Well, listen, every death at an inconvenient moment.
Every death is an inconvenient moment for someone. That's correct. But in this particular case, we did weigh it. Talked with Mr. Weston. We talked to Mr. Robinson at the time and weighed whether we should somehow just scrap a lot, but it just wasn't feasible.
I think for a while we planned to have her on the cover, but we recognized by the time it got to newsstands that it just wasn't that relevant anymore.
Yes, not in exactly the same way. We're always having to balance things.
It was
and
the leadership.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Now at the same time, it's been helpful. Like, for instance, because everything was so planned, we know that King Charles will be coronated in May. So we've been able to plan accordingly for that. We did know that in advance, which actually probably is a good opportunity to just go ahead and launch into this issue. So what we thought we would do is go through, again, like I said, not the March issue. You know what? You go through the March issue. It should be in your mailbox. If not, it should be on its way. But we're going to go through and kind of preview the next issue that has seemed like filled our days for the last few weeks. It's been difficult too because we're giving things to the printer about a week earlier in some cases than we used to. Plus, we have now with 10 issues, we have a month, and then February all the more was a short month. So I don't know why, but I think because of those things, rather, this particular issue seemed like it was painful to get together, even though the content's great.
Well, for some reason, the last 6 months feels like we are working on the magazine like every 15 minutes. I don't know why it's different because I think this is the third year now that we've gone to 10 issues.
It is, and in this particular case, this is a 2-month issue. You'll notice as we keep calling it, it's not just the April issue; it's the April-May issue, and that's why we do 10 issues a year now instead of 12. We jumped from 6 to 10. But that gives us an opportunity to pace things around the holy days. So doing an April-May issue and then later doing an October-November issue gives us the opportunity to rearrange the work around the holy days. And in this case, even though it's the April-May issue, the next issue, which is the June issue, processing actually begins pretty quickly on that because of the way the holy days land. So our breather doesn't really happen right now, but it is going to come a little bit later. So the magazine is not impinging upon the observance of the holy days. But it is. It's also a challenge too because the Living Church News is a 6-issue per year magazine, so they don't sync up exactly. You've got one that's 10 issues a year, one that's 6 issues a year. So yeah, it is. Well, it is pretty intense.
Then that's affected by the holy days as well, but for a different reason. Nobody likes getting their LCN with all the Passover and Days of Unleavened Bread articles after the Days of Unleavened Bread.
That's right.
So we figured out one time that our furthest destination that needed the most time was Australia. And so we took how long it took to get there and backed it out.
Yeah, I think we try to make sure there's a month to 6 weeks. Yeah, we do our best to make sure that based on our processes, right, that we can get it done that much ahead of time. And I should say it's how does any of this happen? Because we have an amazing team, a small team, but an amazing team. In fact, make sure I don't miss any names, Mr. Robinson. I can't imagine that I will. But in addition to myself and Mr. Robinson as the executive and managing editor, we have many others. We have William Williams and Thomas White and Mrs. Jeannie Gwynn, Mr. Ben Graham, and then
Mr. Ames.
Yeah, they're working under Mr. Ames, and then that under Mr. Gerald Weston, and then we have a bevy of reviewers who I'd say volunteers. Some of them are just purely volunteers. Others work here and are volunteers. Volunteers in terms of this, not specifically their job, not part of the editorial department, but they can help us catch typos. And however, more than catching typos, they help us review the content. And I want to make sure I don't put off the blame. I am ultimately responsible if you see any typos, and you want to shout a name into the sky like Kirk shouting Khan, in anger. That'll be me. Yeah, that's kind of where that responsibility ends up falling. Okay, enough chit-chat. Let's talk about the next issue. And first, I just want to start off talking about the cover. We do have a cover process where we get feedback from Mr. Weston, from a variety of artists who contribute possible cover things. We have a team there. And I like this one. It actually shows a variety of real-life newspapers talking about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and kind of gives the main article, the cover article in this particular case. The title is, "Has World War III Already Begun?" Which might seem kind of extreme, but that's just it. If you're actually looking at the news, it's not as extreme as it thinks, and Mr. Weston really makes that case a little bit later. But I'll highlight, just as I wasn't planning on giving a whole lot behind the scenes details here, but the title you see on the cover is not the title of the article itself. We've learned that it makes sense to vary the title on the cover because there's no context whatsoever. Other than the image, and then the cover, the article on the inside might be able to have a more subtle difference. You might be able to fine tune it more to the actual article versus you've got one moment. Even though these aren't on newsstands, we kind of like to imagine perhaps they are. You got one moment to try to get across your question or what it is the person is interested in or asking. They're on the cover. And anyway, kudos to you and the team, Mr. Robinson, because I think it's a good cover. To me, using the newspapers really helps to highlight that this is current. This is what's going on. And
well, one of my favorite things in life is to take full credit for Ben Graham's work. Well, it's not so. Like you were saying, there's actually a group of artists that contribute to the cover, so it's not always Ben Graham. But in this case, it was, and he really composited that one. And had some feedback from the author of that
Mhm.
article. Wait, I'm thinking of sorry, I was actually thinking about the Jerusalem one.
Oh, from the last
Right,
issue.
right, from
That's
last
right.
issue, that one as well. But yeah, he put that together, and I had nothing to do with it, other than good work, Ben. We'll use that.
Hey, well, good. Thank you, Ms. Robinson, for thanking Ben. We'll say that. But actually, that leads, I think, because we tried to organize this. We try to organize ourselves occasionally here on the podcast, and so we're looking at certain articles, and I think that leads to the one you were going to introduce on this particular issue.
Can I mention the personal?
Oh yeah, by all means, do. Oh
Okay.
yeah, I forgot about the personal. Why don't you just lead with that? Thank you.
Well, it really was exactly the point you made at the beginning, which was, what's on Mr. Weston's mind?
Right.
Because he really keeps up with the news cycle, and
Mhm.
he's very patient and very balanced in his assessment. And so when he's actually, in fact, when we get to his article, well, we'll cover that more. But when something really gets his attention and he's willing to talk about it, that's actually saying something, because
Right.
he takes his time. So what I thought was interesting about the personal, this is such a fantastic question for everybody at all times, especially when you're studying the Bible. He starts it off with this provocative paragraph that basically was asked the question, would we, if we had been there at the time of Christ, been a part of the mob that was calling for his death? Crucify him, crucify him. And one of the things I've learned, and I suspect there will be a lot of people that think this is odd, the answer is probably. Because we like to think that we're outside these stories and we wouldn't behave that way if we were in that situation. But I think what the Bible records is 98% of the time we are that person. We just went through the Exodus, and
For the Bible study.
for the Bible study. Well, and then even further on, because we don't get to where the spies go spy out the land and everything. And the only two people who come out of Egypt and make it into the Promised Land are Caleb and Joshua. Nobody else makes it. Everybody else complained. I didn't even notice this. God kept count. There's this one time he addresses their latest complaint, and he says, "This is 10 times now that you've murmured and complained about what's going on."
Wow.
Here. So, others have pointed out that you should read most stories as if you are the person that would have done that. And I know that's a whole other podcast that we could get into, but. Anyway, but here's his key points. What was on his mind? What's he trying to convey out there to our audience? And I think this is still very relevant for us. He points out that most people misunderstood the purpose of Jesus Christ, why he was there and what he was doing. The Jews didn't think he was the Messiah because he did not behave the way they thought he would.
Mm-hmm.
They had plans for him. He was actually taking attention away from them, and it drove them crazy. The Messiah was just supposed to come kick out the Romans so that they could rule their own country and they would be in charge of it, not the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
But then the Christians, on the other hand, do believe that Jesus Christ, the mainstream Christians, we're talking about mainstream Christians, aka not the true,
right?
They do believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, but they take out one of the most important parts of his message, and that is we should live a Christ-like life, which includes keeping the commandments.
Okay.
And that they both groups, the Jews and the Christians, fail to recognize that Christ was also the God of the Exodus, the God of the Old Testament. And that's a key distinction that most of the world doesn't understand. And then he goes on to point out that it's amazing how much he covered in such a short article, but that, again, mainstream Christianity basically evolved from pagan thought and idea. It was just a mixing of some of the new Christian doctrine with all the stuff that they repackaged paganism, essentially. So anyway, I thought that was interesting.
No, I appreciate your highlight that, I've had certain speakers, and I won't name them all. We've mentioned some of those names many times, but when they press questions, well, Mr. Weston is pressed. I've pressed, probably because I've heard him press, that, if you were in the Acts 15 meeting about circumcision, what would you have said? And there's similar things, but much harsher. If you were in Nazi Germany, how would you have responded given the Holocaust? And it's easy to project how we feel now, and then back to those times. What's really hard to do is put yourself in that place. If you project back to a culture in which, say, 98% of the population were thinking this and doing this, reared the way they were, and to imagine yourself back there to think, oh no, I wouldn't have done that. I'd have been part of the 2%. Well, yeah, so you're part of the 98% now who declare they would have been part of the 2% back then.
Right.
Is it takes some humility to put yourself in those places and really evaluate yourself. But when you do, it gives you a certain level of sympathy with them, and then also a fresh perspective on how things are now. And that element of that particular personal, I don't know that I had thought about. But then that leads to his main article in this one, which you were going to introduce.
Sleepwalking into World War III.
And that title was a late addition. He had actually had a different title, and then had heard some things and thought about it, and he asked us real quickly to change that title. And I love it. I think it's great.
No, and
Sleepwalking into World War III.
He's exactly right. So here's some of the key things he points out. One, which was last summer, I went through a lengthy podcast series that talked about the rise of Imperial Japan and everything that preceded the war in the Pacific for World War II. And he points out that and he's probably, I think historians might be correct on this. So in theory, World War II started in 1939, but the Japanese had invaded China in 1937. And in some ways, some say that was actually, if you look back, the start of World War II was kind of there, even though not everybody was participating yet. But that there was a lot of things going on before World War II that are not too dissimilar to what's going on now. And so if you haven't kept up, especially if you're a younger listener, I'm sure you've at least heard of the war going on in Ukraine.
Surely so.
Hopefully, and man, it's really turned into a World War I style fight because the technology has gotten so good that it's easier for the defenders to shoot down aircraft. So the Russians have not entirely, but heavily stopped using aircraft because they were losing too many. And it's a ground war, trench warfare. They're sending waves. I saw a report that claimed that the average life expectancy of a new conscript who reaches the front lines is 4 hours.
Wow.
So I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I just checked the reports again yesterday. I know this is not about that. But like what's going on there is the real deal. And the Russians have lost over 100,000 men already in this fight. And one of the other things, why is that a big deal? Because President Vladimir Putin is all in this war, and he cannot afford to lose. And that's one of the things that Mr. Weston points out in the article. NATO keeps doubling down. They keep drawing lines of, well, we're not going to help with this. We're not going to help with this. We're not going to help with this. And Zelensky goes, no, that's exactly what I need. And we eventually send it. So the battle keeps getting ratcheted up. What's the difference between now and World War II? Everybody has nukes. So the probability that this will grow, because there's one, what should I call him? Historian's not quite right, although you have to know your history to understand where we are now. He's a guy who gets paid to evaluate these kind of things, and he said that the Russians would not stop in Ukraine. He says there's these areas around Russia that are natural choke points, because if you get past them, it's easy to roll through Russia. There's not a lot of natural barriers to an invading army coming through, and they won't stop in Ukraine. They're going to go into Moldova, and then I think eventually, I forget the other countries. But the point is, the probability this will spread is extremely high, and so we may not know it, but World War III may have already occurred. We'll look back some years from now and go, when we're in a wider war potentially, and think, oh, this all started, in March 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine.
Right. That's part of the benefit of articles like this. And even though, our listeners, even though you're young, this is the opportunity to read an article like this and to see things digested in a way that, maybe you're not picking up all the time. I certainly get tired of just listening to news and don't. I tend to feed here and there, want to dip in and dip out. But Mr. Weston not only processes the kind of things that Mr. Robinson is saying, but in an article like this, he gives you the spiritual and prophetic perspective that you just aren't going to see, because people who are just watching world events and analyzing it through the lens of political dynamics don't look at how the Bible informs our understanding of those things. I watched a video last night. I turned it on, and my son Jonathan and my wife were both home. They watched it. I ended up falling asleep 2/3 of the way in, and I was the one that really wanted to see it, I think. But it had to do with the relationship between Russia and China, how not just to assume they're just really friendly types. They actually are natural rivals. They just have a common enemy, which is the West. But you have Russia with all the resources, but less of the market. You have China with a massive market, but not the resources. But in that, he also gave it the presenter gave a great analysis concerning Russia's position, and it was exactly like you said, Mr. Robinson. Back when they controlled most of East Europe, their situation was different. But here, they're so vulnerable there in the West that there's a reason they want these lands. There's a reason they want Ukraine. It's to kind of close some of the holes and close their vulnerability. But you look at all of this, and one, there are spiritual things. Like, we took note in a way that I think few in the world did, though some did, that this has prompted Germany to rearm. Why? Because, and we recognize that's a key moment in terms of what's going on. I say Mr. Winnail, but Dr. Scott and Dr. Doug Winnail and their team doing the News and Prophecies have a News and Prophecy item coming out this week, pointing out that Germany is now looking at potentially restarting the draft in Germany. They have it as an option, but talking about doing it every year, and this is part of what feeds into that. But also, just like Mr. Robinson said, the thing is, world wars don't start with a bunch of people saying, hey, I know we're enjoying a time of peace right now, but why don't we all get together and get all of our countries involved, and let's kick off a global conflict? Hey, that sounds great. No, they start with these regional conflicts. They start in some smaller way, whether it's the assassination of, Archduke Ferdinand or someone else. It starts in some other way and then has the potential to grow. And by the way, the article is not prophesying that this absolutely is World War III, but it's highlighting, and I love the choice of the word sleepwalking in the title, is that you really can just mindlessly, step by step, walk into a global conflict in exactly these kinds of scenarios, where it starts with only two countries, but next some other countries have kind of pitched in, other countries have pitched in different ways, and it continues to escalate. We're sending so much material over there. I mean, when I say material, I mean literal physical equipment and war machines. Next thing you know, you've got your people over there. Maybe they're helping to train, they're whatever, and then an attack kills a bunch of them. And next thing, it's a little harder for your country to kind of stay out of that. You feel like you need to respond in some way. So, yeah, I thought it was a great article.
Well, and Mr. Weston, who's really done his homework on this, highlights a couple of key figures who are saying, we think World War III has already started, including the Pope. In fact, he said, right here, for me today, World War III has been declared, and that was back in May of last year. So, and another thing I thought I might mention that was interesting is, where's my notes?
I don't have them.
Oh, well, just to kind of echo what you said, because he says, Mr. Weston says this in the article, if we try to take everything that happens in the news cycle and try to see where it fits in prophecy, we'll drive ourselves crazy. But what we do have is what Mr. Weston calls the framework of prophecy. We know the big picture. How did Mr. Armstrong accurately predict? What would we say? He was the only. I remember. I'll never forget this. I was in sixth grade. No, seventh. I was in seventh grade. 6th or 7th grade. And the teacher asked us, will West Germany and East Germany ever be reunited?
Really?
And I was the only kid to raise his hand and say, yes, it'll be reunited. Nobody else in my class thought it would be. Why? Because that's what Mr. Armstrong said.
Oh, that's amazing.
And he was right. And Germany was reunified. Well, how did we know that? Well, when we stick with the big picture framework of prophecy, we know that, the key, especially for younger audience members, again, because some people say, well, how, there's all this prophecy of the end time and it doesn't mention America. Okay. Well, God refers to things by their original ancient names. And that's how you
right.
know, how do we know who the Germans are? Because they're anciently the Assyrians. We have a whole booklet on that. Germany and prophecy.
We do. A very nice looking booklet.
Yeah. The U.S. and Britain and prophecy, our booklet goes into a lot of the evidence of how ancient Israel and the tribes and where they migrated and where they ended up. And we rightly call that America and Britain are Ephraim and Manasseh, descendants of Joseph. And that's how we know what's going to happen.
Right.
That's really the most important reason for knowing the national identities, is so you can understand the prophecies.
That's such a great story of you. What, sixth grade? Is that what you said?
I think it was 6th grade, actually.
And that's something that, again, that I feel like you get from our magazine that you're not going to get from Fox News or Twitter or anybody else, is you do get a perspective that looks at prophecy. And way back when this all started, I made a video in my car that's somewhere on the Living Youth YouTube channel to say that that's part of what's really neat about prophecy, is it highlights what we should be looking for that other people aren't. Rather than taking every news item and trying to jam it into the Bible, which is exhausting like that, let the Bible guide us on how to view the things that are happening. And hey, if it doesn't offer a lot of details, then don't stick with a lot of details, but stick with prophecy.
Right.
The prophecy doesn't tell us how the Russia-Ukraine conflict is going to boil down. We don't know the end result of these things, but we do know the overall framework of prophecy, and we do know things that must move forward here and there, and that's what Mr. Weston is focusing on. All right.
Well, one last thing.
Oh, sure.
And then real quick, it's what was interesting to me at the beginning, which I mentioned, which was, well, what is on Mr. Weston's mind? What is on the presiding evangelist? What's catching his attention? We believe rightly that God inspires his leaders, and so he will inspire them and move them in certain directions. And so what I thought was interesting, here's the key point. He uses this, I've heard it before, and I actually really quite like it. He uses this quote from Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises.
Oh, he loves that quote.
Okay. And so I'll just read this quickly to you. Character, let's see. Bill Gordon asks Mike Campbell how he had gone bankrupt. Mike's answer, 2 ways: gradually and then suddenly. And so why that's interesting? Well, Mr. Weston here, just a few weeks ago, gave a sermon here in Charlotte, the very similar themes that he hit on. And what's on his mind? Well, we might be past the gradually phase and be in the suddenly phase. I mean, and he said, I think from here on out, we should be ready for suddenly.
Yeah.
And that, when Mr. Weston says that I take note of that, because he doesn't.
He's very careful
Yes.
about saying things right and not overreacting to things. It's one of his real strengths. So yeah, we need to be mindful that we could be in the suddenly phase of a whole lot of things.
How do we get into World War III?
Gradually and then suddenly.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So and by the way, we spent a lot of time on that. I see we're already well more than 30 minutes into the podcast, but that was our cover article. I think it deserves the time, and definitely anything Mr. Weston writes deserves your attention. But we want to hit a few other articles in this. For instance, I will mention, you may not realize this, Mr. Robinson, and I should try to validate it somehow, but this magazine may have set a record for all Tomorrow's World magazines in history. It might be the highest number of Roman numerals to appear in a title. That's clearly of global consequence. In fact, they're both the Roman numeral 3. So we had a World War III article, and then we have this one I will mention by Mr. John Meakin there in the UK, the coronation of King Charles III. It's interesting, we read King Charles III, and we don't, though we could, read it as World War the Third.
Yeah.
That would be rather odd. But anyway, the coronation of King Charles III. Now, you might think now, of course, if you're there in England or a part of His Majesty's realm in one way or the other, might understand why this is important immediately, because this is your regent. But that said, some of us otherwise may not recognize why it's important. And then there's others who we want to know, but it just seems foreign to us, both literally, but also just culturally, that, what is something like this? What is this? What does it even mean to have someone coronated? It's interesting. They really planned so much of this long before, decades ago, even when Queen Elizabeth was crowned. They looked at what they would do in terms of the succession, and all this is part of a plan. Well, Mr. Meakin does such a wonderful job for those of us, like I'm an American, what happens in a coronation like this, of actually laying it out. And he brings out the fascinating details that it's very easy for us not to even expect, especially as our world is getting more and more secular. When you have the crowning of a king, you're starting to touch on, if not exactly ancient rituals, because your kingly line goes back so far, but they do change over time. And yet even those rituals are still grounded in more ancient things. So you have a moment in a culture where, rather than something, up to date, we're talking about social media, or we're taking a look at corporate law, suddenly you're looking at a culture as it is dipping into the deep well of its culture and going back to its pillars that are at the very foundation of that civilization. And as a result, in this particular case, you see a lot of references, and you will see them if you watch the coronation. You'll see a lot of references to biblical principles. You'll see actual references that potentially go back to the days of Israel and the coronation of kings in ancient Israel. And I think Mr. Meakin does a great job for me, kind of as a literary tourist, that I'm reading this about a land in which I don't live, to talk about it. Like the first subsection he's got here called The Anatomy of a Coronation. He goes through the different parts that will be involved, talks about the biblical precedents concerning that. And I think ends appropriately at the end by calling for all of us to pray for the king. The Bible literally does say we should pray for our rulers, and it might just seem like a figurehead position, but I personally suspect far less than his mother. I suspect that King Charles is very comfortable with trying to use the clout that comes from his position to actually press some agendas in the world. And that can be for good, it can be for ill. We could take bets right now if we don't actually gamble concerning which would be, but he is among those that we actually should pray for. So I would actually recommend, all the more if you're going to try to watch the news about the coronation that's coming in May, but even if you're not, to take a look at, here we have an Anglo-Saxon nation. We have a descendant of ancient Israel that is about to conduct a ceremony with ties that go all the way back to some elements even of the Davidic line of King David. And I think it's a worthwhile thing to bring out to our readers, and I'm so grateful for Mr. Meakin's hard work in putting this together.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I thought he did a fascinating look into, I think even in his own words, he referred to it as, majesty, pomp, and ancient ceremony. And man, I tell you what, the British are quite good at that.
Oh yeah.
And anyway, it's interesting that you took the same thing away, that was the other thing I took, which was pray for the kings and all who are in authority.
That's right.
And man, isn't that's
really,
a command? We take it for granted that God's directing things, but at the same time, He tells us that we should pray for our kings and our leaders.
He does, and I'll add, and I want to give credit to. I regrettably I might get wrong who it is, but I know William Williams and Thomas White worked on this. We have a kind of a standard letter when people ask about the stone of destiny, which is this stone that we really do believe ties back to ancient Israel and is involved in the coronation of kings, and it will be involved. You may hear something in the news about the stone of Scone or stone of Scone, or however it's properly said, or sometimes called the stone of destiny. And right at the end of Mr. Meakin's article, we have a Tomorrow's World Q&A, in which here in the editorial department they work to put that together based on the other material that we've normally written about that, because I remember it actually being announced, because it was kind of a question. You never know when the parties in England, you've got various parties, and you have those in Ireland who think, what's going on? What are we going to do? Are they really going to share? Are they going to make a stink about it? But they didn't. They're all coming together, and indeed the stone is going to be there. And it was a little bit of news when that was announced. So again, we probably need to move on. Don't want to linger too much, but kudos to Mr. Meakin for a wonderful job on this article, and I look forward to y'all reading it.
Okay, our next article, which was Live Not by AI Lies. In other words, artificial intelligence lies.
Oh, that sounds great. Who's that? I bet whoever wrote that, I bet it was masterful.
I'll have to look it up. No, our executive editor, Mr. Wallace Smith, wrote that one. And we did, of course, many of you probably heard our podcast where we talk about artificial intelligence. But this is a more focused look on it. And I still think, even if you'd heard that podcast, it's still worth your time, because what Mr. Smith does here in this article is he really zeroes in on what's possible. Now, we start off the article and illustrate it with a really fanciful image, because it was amazing what could be created that just...
With a few words.
Yeah, just a few words, crafting an entire fantasy-looking image. But the real point of the article focuses in actually on the opposite, which is how far the technology has come to replicate things that look realistic. We're now to the point where it's extremely difficult for us to tell that something's faked. So in other words, the article goes through point by point to show that the technology already exists largely to make up faces that look very realistic. We can, and as I mentioned, the image that we craft for the beginning of the magazine, completely made up. But you can very accurately depict voices. You in the article you have we actually record, or say record. We relate the transcript of your conversation with ChatGPT, and if we didn't tell you, you would assume he had interviewed a human being. So you can realistically fake faces, voices, conversation, and this includes video. There's all the deepfake videos where you can make somebody's head. In fact, I saw one that was really quite troubling, and it was like a late night show, and it was a comedian, I think, and as he starts talking, he starts impersonating Tom Cruise. And the deepfake maker has his face slowly morphed to where he looks like Tom Cruise, and it looks like, so this guy's doing an impersonation of Tom Cruise while the video has made him look like Tom Cruise, and then he fades back. He fades back to the who he really is. But artificial relationships where you feel like you actually have a friend that's actually just an algorithm with a large language model that knows how to simulate a conversation.
Right.
But you go on to point out that in the wrong hands, and also that with Satan being the god of this world pushing us in a certain direction, in the wrong hands, you could just wholesale cloth make up an entire story about a person, and people would not know. Most people would not know.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. I wish, and I'm looking at one of the pages of the magazine right now, the really nice looking woman, young woman. I say young woman. I think I aimed at her age to be in her 30s or maybe 40s when I made the prompt, which now that I'm in my 50s, I could say young.
Well, your comment, I didn't realize this was in my subconscious. I thought it was difficult to determine the age.
Oh, really? Interesting.
There's almost something about the way the face was generated. It was
right. I think I said my prompt was simple. It was like LinkedIn profile, woman in her, 30s or 40s. I can't even remember anymore. But it was just, the face that you'll see on page, looks like page 18. Understand, I made that, quote unquote, like right before I brushed my teeth. I took a shower, brushed my teeth, and said, "Oh, hey, I'll just make this face." And with just a few words, generated that. The article highlights that might seem like, "Oh, well, that's interesting," but so what? No, these things like this are being used for espionage purposes, even back before they were as good as they are. We also have Mr. Robinson. He said something that I wish I could have spent more time on. Because one of the angles I really wanted to have in the article, and it does get to that, and I'm so grateful. We had to edit it down by about like 1,000 words, what I wrote. I'm so grateful for our editing team because I didn't have much more time to work on it.
So let's put that in perspective. 1,000 words is like a page and a half.
It is. Oh yeah, we were aiming. I think we need to aim it around, I'm thinking 3,100 words or so, and I had about 4,100. And I appreciate their hard work at helping me determine the fat to cut off. I've done that work. It's hard work, and they do it well.
Very good at it.
But it does retain one thing I wanted to discuss, which was this idea of artificial relationships, even, and the idea that part of why the potential for AI to deceive in the future, it's not just the technical capacity. Like some of you have seen these scams, and maybe you don't fall for them because you're more savvy, but there are older people who do fall for them, where someone reaches out to you, someone, quote unquote, on Facebook. "Oh, I'm in a jam. I just need, I need $1,000 real quick," or whatever. And it's like, okay, this is totally fake. But now you're at the potential where AI can actually learn how to mimic those people and converse with you for a while to talk to you. And there is a case in here, even though it's an older case, back before these things got good, it mentions in this article, it was just a few years ago, where more like almost $250,000, maybe a little more, it might have been more, was actually stolen from a UK company by people using AI to imitate the voice of a German executive of that company. And it was convincing enough that the individual made the transfer. So that was years ago. Part of the theme of this article is that this stuff is getting so good that it's getting not only getting hard to tell, but the main theme I really want to get is it doesn't have to be perfect, because our self-deceiving hearts will tend to travel the other distance and actually make it that much more effective. And the idea of artificial relationships, I highlight this example in there where this young man, I won't go into all the details, read the article when it comes out, but this young man essentially used AI to simulate his dead girlfriend. And the guy who made that AI thought it was so great, he was going to expand it as a broader app that other people can do to simulate their dead loved ones so they can continue to have conversations with them, after they've gone. And while OpenAI kind of intervened and may have been influenced by what he was doing to kind of shut down that avenue, Amazon has kind of embraced it, and the Amazon's even put out a video illustrating at one of their conventions how you can have children, if they want to hear a storybook, they can just have grandma read it, and grandma's dead, but now grandma's reading the book to the child using Alexa or whatever the case may be. What didn't make the magazine because there wasn't room or space was a New York Times article on these individuals, mainly in Japan. But if you think that means it wouldn't happen elsewhere, you're not thinking clearly. Where you have individuals that truly are creating quote unquote relationships, even marrying quote unquote these fictional characters. That, like one guy said, with the AI app that he had, it actually made that character kind of come to life to a certain extent. He could communicate with it, etc. And what is it going to do to our brains? Our relationships are already corroding, let alone now you have something that part of what he said he liked about the AI, character that he was able to interact with is, we don't make any demands on each other, right? She always listens, it's, well, yeah, like a Stepford wife, for those who understand that, real relationships require you to change yourself to meet the other person's need. Even, Mr. Robinson and I here have a good friendship and a working relationship. And I guarantee you, Mr. Robinson has had to change in some ways to respond to me. We even talked about the other day, whether it's an informing style or my passive aggressive comment about something that he picked up on. And he did say passive aggressive, which actually I have to, what is a fair cop? That was a fair cop. It was a passive aggressive statement. And I've had to modify for him as well, because that's what real relationships do. And what this fellow, this is not in the article, but the spirit of it informed what I wrote. He's describing what seems like the ideal relationship, and it's not. He's one person in no relationship who is doing nothing but having his ideal things fed, and he's having to change for no one. That is like the satanic version of what a relationship should be. And AI is making this, it's easy to say it's not, that's a bit too far. We've been saying it several times, putting this magazine together. We were writing this in February 2023. Just look out for February 2024 and to see what's capable.
Yeah, exactly. There was a study done that found, and it was actually a high predictor of whether a couple would get divorced or not. And they would measure the daily number of negative interactions. But what was fascinating, it's obvious to anybody, if you have too many negative interactions every day, day after day, then that relationship will likely end. But what was fascinating was they can also drop too low.
Interesting.
And because, to your point, we need a little bit. I mean, God describes it as iron sharpening iron. We need a little bit of friction in our life. We need a little bit of contention because it drives us to be better. Right. Frankly, if we do it correctly. I mean, there's two ways you can go. You can improve, or you can become bitter and resentful. So I would recommend improving your life, because bitter and resentful just makes everything worse. But this AI thing is actually. You really can craft a whole fake world and live in it if that's what you want to do. And that's not good for you.
It is increasingly capable. And as we wrap this up and move on to the next article, our world is already geared toward deception. It's almost getting to be more deception in the world than truth, really, which probably has been in many ways for a long time. But why? Because it's the ruler of this world is the father of lies. And we have just crafted as human beings, which will only improve, one of the greatest reality imitating tools we have ever created in our life, in history. Just think of a world that's run by the father of lies, and finally not his creation, but those over whom he rules now has tools to deceive like never before. And so the article tries to talk about that potential.
So we recommend reading it.
We do even though I know the writer, he's kind of a flake, but we do recommend reading that one. By the way, it's me. Did he just call one of the writers? I wrote that one. All right.
Okay, our next article that we'd like to mention is one written by Mr. Rod McNair. I think that was in Tomorrow's Family Today section.
Tomorrow's Families Today.
Okay.
Yeah, that piece.
And it's Don't Fall for Perfectionism. And the reason, Mr. Smith, that I could introduce this is I also heard Mr. McNair give. So naturally, the article will actually be a lot smaller in scope compared to the sermon, just for space. But I heard the sermon where he gave here in Charlotte, and here's what's fascinating about this to me. This is not a problem I have, but I know a lot of people who do, which is, in fact, one of my children, and I'll just leave it at that, is something that they can fall prey to, which is like you actually really drive yourself. You're really hard on yourself. You don't want to make mistakes. You try to be perfect, and you don't want to let people down. And not only is that not realistic, but it's actually a bad path to go down. But the point, when I say that's not a problem for me, I just meant I was never one of those people that had an obsession with being perfect, and then when I messed up that I felt really bad about it, and I was like, we'll get it next time. But I know a lot of people that are that way, and I was really glad he addressed it. And this is where I think that the author is significant, because Mr. McNair himself, especially in the sermon, shared his own stories of how he struggled with that when he was earlier. So like, the credibility factor was extremely high on this topic because he was aware this is something he had to deal with and overcome. But the larger point that he makes as it goes on, I thought this was an interesting quote that he had in there, and that is, a man who lives only for himself has not begun to live. And I thought that was an interesting way to put it. But like a couple other quotes, our culture often seems to push young people toward an entitled life without any responsibility. In other words, you deserve it. But that's the wrong angle to go to. But his final one here, he says, perfectionism is a trap that hinders us from truly making progress on the path to our ultimate destiny in God's kingdom. Focus on growth. Don't fall for perfectionism. In other words, be realistic that you're going to make mistakes, but that is a driver of how you develop a character. It's probably the best way of summarizing that. But
one of the reasons that was we were divvying up the articles, that was one of the reasons I thought it'd be helpful for Mr. Robinson to introduce that article, is because he was here for that sermon, and I was not. I was out of town serving someplace else. And, all the more, I remember hearing about the sermon and wishing that I had the opportunity to hear it, and then appreciated the article and thought, boy, this is a great message, because the Bible literally encourages us to strive for perfection. Be you perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect. And yet at the same time, people can take that the wrong way and go in an unhealthy direction, not focusing on the growth versus constantly focusing on feeling terrible that you're not perfect, or undercutting yourself from that perspective. So I appreciated the article, but all the more it's interesting that you say that he shared personally in that sermon, because he does do that in the article a bit as well. He talks about this book, which I actually would like to get, by Woodrow Wilson, When a Man Comes to Himself, and talks about how helpful that was, even though it was in 1915, it was written a long time ago. So thank you for mentioning that one, Mr. Robinson. I know everybody will appreciate it.
There's a book I know people have heard of her, Brene Brown, and she wrote a book called The Gifts of Imperfection, because she had a real problem with the perfectionist thing. And what happens is, here's the problem with perfectionism. You're not perfect, and you are going to make mistakes. And so you can really get into this negative spin cycle and spiral you down. But she's also had a lot of credibility. And her point was, no, we should view these little imperfections as like drivers of our character, and that we get better. So just to echo
that's
again,
very in tune with that.
Like there's science behind it, I guess is what I'm saying. Not that Mr. McNair needed additional credibility, but like this is a well-known, well-researched concept.
Great. Okay, then we just have one more we're going to talk about before we wrap up. We're going to be we're here about an hour or so this will be a good length for
that. Sounds about right.
Does sound about right for us. And there is an article by Mr. Douglas Winnail, Dr. Douglas Winnail. It's a 2-pager there, titled "When the Blind Lead the Blind." And actually, I'm going to put Mr. Robinson on the spot before I even talk about the article, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But he illustrated this one. Mr. Robinson, I shouldn't presume that all of you listening know out there, Mr. Robinson is responsible for the layout of the magazine, the art direction. It definitely gets, input, from like on the covers from various ones as possibilities, and definitely Mr. Weston. But he's responsible for all that. And this one looks like it has for the illustration is like a wood grave. I think there used to be a wood engraving they used to use for book presses stuff, and it has these three blind fellas. Sure enough, it is essentially the blind leading the blind. And I'm just curious, how was it challenging to find this one? Because we talked about illustrating a booklet recently that had kind of a similar theme of blindness. I was just curious.
Well, unlike that article, which took, well, no, that was for a booklet.
That's for a booklet. Right?
That did take quite a while because the blindfolded people. You would think just putting a blindfold on somebody would like illustrate that they can't see, but somehow it just
it was rougher than it was.
It was problematic. This one I actually found pretty quickly. This will be a little fun fact for our listeners that most other people wouldn't know is that picture is actually bigger than you'll see in the magazine, and I didn't have enough room for everything. And there's actually a fourth figure.
Oh, really?
Once you look at it, you could tell that's how it is. But if you just looked at it and didn't know, you wouldn't be able to tell because it's cropped out. Maybe it looks like a rock or something like that. But that is a fourth person who's all the more falling off the road because he can't see.
Oh, I can, see that? Looking at it, I could see that now. Yeah, that's probably what that is. You're right. I just assumed it was a rock or something like that. So very interesting.
We don't generally use this kind of engraved style, but for this one, it actually seemed to work.
I thought it fit. And yeah, let me just say I'm very grateful for you for many reasons, Mr. Robinson, but that's one of them. Otherwise, all these would just be stick figures, and I would be drawing the stick figures.
That's a style too.
It's definitely a style. But this article with Dr. Cornell, we need to wrap up here real quickly, but I'll mention it's one of those things again. And among the families out there listening, I know is the Wilson family, and Mr. Wilson sent an email not long ago. I know them. I love you. In fact, you're probably listening now. Love you guys, Wilson clan. So appreciate you very much. But he had made this comment about a prophetic framework in terms of how to see the world, just differing from the world's framework, which focuses on so many things. And Dr. Mill does a great job in this particular article highlighting the difference in terms of how to see what's going on in the world and how to see what's going on with leaders in the world. And that really deep down, oh boy, it's interesting. I was listening to something just this morning that was highlighting what's going crazy with credentialed people. We have an increasing class of people who are kind of making huge decisions about how society should be shaped and how we should all run our lives. And they say, you've got to listen to me because, and after the name, they have a string of letters based on all the credentials they've earned, et cetera. Well, sure, they've gone and they've earned all these degrees, and you've got people in leadership positions in government that have been there for years and years and years. And on one hand, yes, that should mean something. But none of that includes is actual spiritual insight and understanding, which as our culture has continued to deviate from the ways of God and continues on that path, then our credentialed experts, if you will, are continually deviating as well. And as a result, they are more and more blind and not able to see how they really should direct things. If you go back to, I would guess, let's say 50 years. Oh boy, that just gets us to the 70s. I forgot how old I am. Let's go back 100 years. Go back a little further, where you had people that were maybe earning degrees, right? They're going and they're getting an education, or you had world leaders that are trying to apply various principles, but they're doing so in a culture that, at least as a default, was giving you certain morals, giving you a certain direct, at least what we could say secularly is a Judeo-Christian ethic. Well, then you got at least better results, but it wasn't because as much of their education is the fact that education and that leadership experience took place in an environment that at least forced you to pretend you had a certain morality, maybe even if you didn't have it. But we have departed from that for so long that now you have these experts and you have these leaders that don't have that as a background. And as a result, all we have is their secular ideology, their secular experience, their secular education, their secular goals and design. And as a result, increasingly, we are being led by spiritually blind people. And I think Dr. Cornell brings that out very plainly and very straightforwardly, that look, it was prophesied to be this way, that you're going to have essentially blind leaders. And do you really want to be walking around a place where there's potholes and there's cliffs and there's, burning dumpster fires? And you're blind and you're holding the coat, like in Mr. Robinson's illustration that he chose there, and you're just holding the coat of someone who's leading you, counting on them to guide you through all of this, but they're just as blind as you are, right? And then maybe so they have someone blind in front of them. It's a really evocative image that Mr. Robinson chose there. And I think in a simple 2 pages, Dr. Winnail highlights that principle really well. And I like the subheads, which I don't know if is one of Dr. Winnail's originals or if it's an editorial creation, because it was processed, quite a bit. In terms of what we do, we go through, we edit, we if we have to add new subheads, we do all that. So I don't know if it's to our credit or his, but I like one, and it'll mean something maybe to more of our adult listeners that are parents of, or anyway, it's the immoral majority. And I thought it was a great play on words, because you used to have the moral majority. We used to say, oh, well, there's the moral majority in terms of the people of your society who are kind of making decisions and don't like the way things are going. But it's no longer the moral majority. Now we're actually living in a world where it's the immoral majority, and it kind of highlights the point. So anyway, I definitely appreciated the article.
Well, I mean, you and I could have never imagined even 10 years ago, let alone when we were going through high school and college age, that we would actually be in a place in our country where there's some dispute over what a male and a female is. And, Matt Walsh was testifying before the Tennessee state legislature over their law they did.
I was listening to him this morning, yeah.
And somebody asked one of the senators I guess it would be congressional.
It might have been a state senator.
State senator. Matt Walsh is just making the common sense.
Yeah, he says, and what is your
what are your credentials?
What are your credentials there? And do you remember how?
Are you a doctor? It's almost like you cannot actually have an opinion on whether there's males and females unless you're a doctor. So that's right. Where we're at now.
And he said his response was, "My credentials? Oh, well, I have a brain, and I can read, and with my brain, I'm paraphrasing. I think it's good not to mutilate children, and I think that
and I can read the studies,
and I can exactly, I can read the studies, and don't get me wrong." People will cite studies that back their opinion, but that's kind of the magical world of studies, is there's studies that disagree. That's one of the illusions they want to give us these days, is no, we're all, as scientists and doctors, unified in this position. When no, they're unified in their possession of the microphone to be able to speak and represent the rest. But no, there are people that disagree that just aren't heard.
You and I talked recently about how Dr. Meredith, did you say 2017, 2019 had an article called Satan's alternate.
Oh no, 2019 was after he died. It was before 20, but it was close to 2017. Close,
yeah. Satan's alternate reality, and it's just that, man. It's almost like he was a prophet, because that is what we are seeing in spades right now, between the artificial intelligence fake world we can make, and that people literally want to live in a fake world where we can actually change genders. Like any honest biologist will tell you, that is an insane proposition. I mean, you can maim yourself and be a crude facsimile of another gender, but down to your chromosomes, are a male or a female.
Yeah, absolutely. Even I know one biologist that I follow on Twitter. He makes it that much plainer, because people talk about different chromosomal disorders, but so little of that, as we talk about in our fantastic DVD, The Truth Behind the Transgender Agenda.
There's an agenda?
Or movement. I think I said movement. I would have liked agenda better, but I don't know, transgender agenda. It kind of sounds awkward to say. Regardless. Transgender. It's a great DVD, though. My tie doesn't look as nice as I wanted, regardless. But hey, listen to that DVD. I think the DVD is really good. But he highlights that, no, really, male and female is kind of clear. There's essentially 2 kinds of gametes that are created for reproduction. There's eggs and there's sperm. And your capacity, or whether your body is geared toward making one or the other, universally indicates if you're male or female. And even in cases where there's chromosomal disorders, it's still actually really plain. But yeah, absolutely. I'd say the scientists that are worth their salt still recognize that and will say it. Mm-hmm. There are those who recognize it but are afraid to say it. And then there are those that are just corrupt themselves completely, and they've kind of like what Paul says in Romans 1, they've lost the ability to discern. They have become so corrupted, and they're not worth their salt at all.
One, even worse, some people profit from it.
Yes, absolutely. And how did this come to be? Because we have blind leaders leading the blind, covered by Dr. Douglas S. Winnail. I think that's what we wanted to cover today, right?
If you're not out there rushing to your mailbox trying to get the magazine, I don't know what it will take.
But how else can we better sell it? And again, this is not this issue.
Yeah.
Go explore this issue that you have waiting there for you and find all the goodies we have. But we really enjoyed putting the next issue together as well, and we just thought it'd be great to talk to you about it.